What the hell is wrong with your ship? Non-human comm discipline isn't quite as good as the human equivalent. As I understand it, they never had to deal with the crackling early radios that informed our procedures. Sure, on most worlds when a communication spell was first developed, it was the domain of a high priest or archmage, but it was clear. Still, I'd expected a slightly better introduction to the local traffic control net than a half-panicked voice asking a question that made no sense. This is Frontier Helm Control, all ship systems reporting nominal. To whom am I speaking? I glanced down at my board after I finished speaking. The ship systems were reporting nominal by not activating any shrieking klaxons or flashing lights. But with a few pokes to the controls in front of me, I was able to project a little hologram of the ship's status. Everything was outlined in happy green. Nominal? I'm registering explosions at your aft end! The speaker still didn't identify himself, and he still sounded panicked. I reached out, grabbed the hologram, rotated it around to view the backside of the ship, and then zoomed in until I was looking at fairly low-level systems. I wasn't as far down as I could go. The ship would happily report on the status of individual circuit boards and breakers, but I was surely low enough that I could see anything that a local space station could see. Some components were haloed in light green rather than dark green, but that only meant that they were coming up on a service date. I drummed my fingers against the control board, mentally debating if I should launch a drone for an external view, or if I should respond with, "Everything's good," a second time. On the one hand, whoever I was talking to was probably looking at me in a freaking scrying mirror and shouting into a pointy hat or something, so there was seriously no way they'd have noticed something that the ship's sensors hadn't. On the other hand, I didn't want to end up in textbooks as an example of why only a jackass would ignore panicked warnings from traffic control. Then the hologram changed. A tiny icon shaped like an idealized hydrogen atom exited the back of the ship. A dozen lines lanced out at it, and a flare of fire blossomed behind the ship's pusher plate. Because I was paying attention, I felt the ship give a tiny shudder as we decelerated very slightly. There it is! There again! I just saw a huge explosion behind your ship! Oh, sorry. You're registering our drive system control. All systems are nominal and everything is under control. This, at least, seemed to calm the alien traffic control operator down a tiny bit. I was assuming it was a male from the pitch of his voice. Translation spells are nicer than the computerized equivalent. They tend to give speakers roughly the voice the listener would expect given the nature of the speaker, even if the original speech was in the form of wild tentacle gesticulations and skin color changes via some alien squid thing. This voice was sort of nasal and high, but definitely male. He at least listened to me this time. You're telling me your ship is deliberately firing off a series of huge fireballs? Is that safe? Perfectly safe, Control. You're seeing laser-triggered fusion pulses. They're as clean as mother's milk. That wasn't strictly true. Even laser-pumped fusion makes some tritium. But it's not very hot and the half-life is short enough that even if some mutant atoms end up in a planet's upper atmosphere, they aren't going to hurt anyone. None of that translated. The speaker's voice had become more nasal and somewhat accusatory, as though I had any control over what its spells could or could not translate. But if that's your drive, then don't come any closer. I need to talk to someone about this. Then the line cut off. Control! That's not how this works! The explosions are my brakes! I didn't get any answers. I should probably back up enough for a little context. Mankind made contact with extraterrestrial life for the first time when the Umalak's enormous crystalline spaceship floated out of the sky and set down in the wilds of Alaska. There was a lot of turmoil in response to that, of course, but the strangest part came when they told us why they were on Earth and how they'd gotten there. Pure faith had carried them through space faster than a beam of light, and they were here to tell humanity of our divine mission. We hadn't believed them on either count. Tackling their technology seemed easier than tackling their belief system, so we'd set about examining everything they were willing to show us, absolutely certain that it was standard tech that they didn't understand, and had thus reduced to superstition. Perhaps the ship had been built long before it had been piloted to Earth by a now-fallen civilization. It was not. Long story short, it was not. The Umalak allowed us to examine their technology in any way we requested. They knew what would happen before we started. We found nothing capable of doing anything in it, and as soon as we looked closely at it, the tech stopped functioning. Next, the Umalak explained how the ship had been built, and indeed they had built it themselves. The crystals that made it up were grown over the course of 3 generations, nurtured by the prayers of their entire civilization, A holy order of monks was founded to slowly shape the crystals into livable spaces and workable power focuses. And when the end of construction was finally in sight, 12 times as many traveler priests as was normally needed were taught the chants and hymns of fast travel and breathable air. The very best of that group was selected to pilot the ship, and only with this extraordinary effort were they able to land a ship on Earth, and then only by keeping it well away from most of the population. Then they explained humanity's divine mission. In the beginning, God created the universe. He created the races therein, and to them he gave the ability to adjust the rules of reality so that they might not perish under the iron fist of physics. The races of the vastness grew proud. They called their powers magic, and said that the wonders they worked were of will and mind rather than through faith. So, on a planet with more iron in its heart than any other, a race with cold iron in its very blood was born. To this race was given special magic, a magic that enforced the rules of the Creator. This race would humble the works of the Magi and test even the faithful. This time, God wasn't screwing around. We would assert the rules of reality wherever we examined some things. Humans didn't get a choice in that. So that was our mission, to survive and travel. Of course, most people thought that was a load of crap. There was even a contingent of people sufficiently contrary, or self-loathing, that said we shouldn't travel the galaxy. However, the general reaction was, "There's a great big fantastic universe out there and you're going to help us get to it? Well, praise the alien lord and pass the booster rockets." A new space race was on. It eventually produced 3 key technologies that gave mankind the stars: laser lifters, the Orion Drive, and the Orion 2. Laser lifters were the simplest. If you focus a sufficiently powerful beam into a thruster, that's essentially nothing more than a durable black cup, then all the air inside flashes to plasma and the cup is tossed upwards. Do that a few thousand times and the cup, as well as anything attached to it, is in space without the brutal constraints imposed by the device having to haul its own fuel with it. All of the research into lasers let us crack fusion. We were massively aided in this by having allies who could magically mine metallic hydrogen from gas giants. We probably could have built Orions with fission devices, but it was an almost perfect drive with laser-pumped pulsed fusion. The Orion 2 wasn't related to the Orion Drive from an engineering standpoint. But the bridge radio clicked on again, and brought me the still nasal and slightly frustrated-sounding voice of Control. "Okay, I talked to my boss, who talked to his boss, who talked to diplomatic affairs. For some reason, I've got to let your Doom Machine approach. So here you go, park it there, and try not to blow it up. Well, not any more than you already are." The hologram of the ship was replaced with holographic representation of the parking orbit Control wanted the Frontier to take. I thought, not for the first time, that the translation spells used by most races really are amazing. Control had probably put a voodoo doll of the Frontier into a scale model of the system, expecting a diagram to show up in my scrying bowl or some such. But, because of the translation spell, the information made it to me in a format that the ship's computer could interpret. Better yet, because the spell was acting on their communication and not my reception, the human anti-magic field couldn't turn it off. There was a sharp click of static, and the hologram in front of me shifted to a bunch of juvenile squid aliens, playing a game that looked a lot like dodgeball. One of these aliens, a small and awkward one even to my human eyes, was getting the worst of it. Several other beings were pelting it mercilessly with balls, and each of them was using more than one tentacle at a time. Then that image started to fuzz and break up. I quickly looked away from the hologram. Modern comms training included a fairly extensive section on not thinking too hard about just how aliens, who have never discovered radio, are speaking to you. The human anti-magic field always gets a vote if you catch its attention. Let's see, the bastard over at Control had stuck me in his system's L2 point. L2 is way out past the moon and it's gravitationally unstable. If I'd just gotten a normal parking orbit, I could have shut off the ship's engines and taken some much-needed rack time. But oh no! Because Control thought I was going to blow up, I was going to have to periodically correct the ship's position. On top of that, I suspected the Orion Drive was too powerful for that work. It would be like trying to make a golf putt with a sledgehammer. So I had to run our maneuvering thrusters way more than they were really designed for. I looked back down at the holo. It was back to being a display of Frontier's parking space. "Parking orbit acknowledged, Control," I said through clenched teeth. There was a long silence, and I thought maybe Control had wandered off without telling me for a moment. Then the line went live again, and Control spoke hesitantly. So, why is your trip that important anyway? I ran my tongue across my teeth, wondering just how to answer that. We were in a Vaughn system. The Vaughn were a race of mighty wizards, of the sort that humanity was sent to humble and bring low. We'd been doing a great job of that. The Vaughn had a lot of desire for human consumer goods. Our technology filled niches their magic handled poorly, and anyone could use it without training. Yet all we could buy from them was raw materials. Their military was nearly useless against us because we shrugged off their most potent death magic like it had never been cast. They could throw a rock at us or telekinetically fire an arrow, but that was only if they caught us off guard. So a species with 100 planets to their name was having to normalize diplomatic relations with a single planet species, as though we were total equals. I wasn't exactly shocked the Vaughn leaders hadn't publicized this meeting well enough for Control to be ready for us. I also wasn't going to give away their secrets. Just some trade negotiations. Control's only reply was a sigh so thick with annoyance that I actually started to feel for the guy. Embarrassing or not, the local traffic control facilities really should have been told they were going to be dealing with a completely alien spaceship. No one ever thinks of the little guy. Again, I thought Control had signed off without announcing it, but he came back one last time. Okay, I've got to ask. You're using fireballs to push yourself around space, which is still nuts, but I learned back in school only 1 or 2 really special spells can move something faster than light. Pyromancy definitely doesn't do it. So how did you make the interstellar leg of your trip? The Orion 2 wasn't related to the Orion Drive from an engineering standpoint, but they were philosophical and spiritual brothers. Humanity couldn't learn directly from the Umalak, but we could stand way over there with a particle detector while they used miracles to torment space-time. And the Umalak just loved to do that for us, because they basically saw it as helping angels learn God's will. Eventually, we learned to make a GEC, a gravity-emitting circuit. Because the electroweak force is so much stronger than the gravitational force, it's possible to supercharge one of those until it very briefly becomes a singularity. If you toss such an artificial black hole in front of a ship, and lace enough GECs throughout the ship that the force gradient across it is even, so you don't get spaghettified, you've got an FTL drive. Better yet, if you use a second artificial singularity inside the first, or a third in the second, or a fourth in the third, and so on, you can go really fast indeed. It annoys physicists and mathematicians because they can't even begin to describe where the ship is after that bit of fuckery. But the tech tested as safe. At least it's safe for human equipment and Earth life. It's not so safe for Umalak. We learned that when one of their high priests took a historic first ride on one of our holy vessels. They started screaming and they didn't stop until a faith healer wiped their memory. Their whole memory. The high priest was left as little more than a mentally damaged infant, and everyone agreed the cure was way better than the disease. The most sensible thing the priest said while he still had his memories was, "They can see me! They can see me! They can see you, but you can't see them! They can touch me, but they can't touch you! You can touch them! Save me! Save me! Save me! Will you save me?" The official human explanation is that the Umalak have some sort of subconscious connection to the normal universe that allows them to achieve the things they can do. Taking them so far out of the normal universe causes them a form of stress that can damage their minds. The official Umalak explanation is that some sort of horrible thing is looking into our universe from outside, and maybe they were wrong about just what humanity needs to do. Perhaps we weren't just supposed to annoy wizards. Maybe we need to fly around in the high warp bands, acting like border guards for reality. Their church is in a bit of a state of flux. I just spent a month in those warp bands, and the only danger I'd felt was boredom, so I don't know what to think. It is nice to imagine that my mind set a big brace down in the spine of reality itself, but it's kind of far-fetched. What I do know is there's no way I was going to explain any of that to Control. I'd end up with a parking orbit in a neighboring star system, or maybe he'd tell me to go in for a landing on the system's sun. The force of will? I answered into the radio. Yeah, pure willpower. Everyone on the ship just wants to go faster than light really badly, and then we go faster than light. Oh, well, good. At least you've got a sensible FTL drive. Jeez, you should just get that working in system. Way better than those fireballs. Anyway, your approach vector is clear. Perform ascending if you need anything. Control out. The talks with the Vaughn went well. The biggest incident was when one of the younger secretaries attached to the delegation lost all of her magical cosmetics. She had apparently been wearing a lot of them, and apparently her coworkers hadn't known. I keep saying apparently, because the Vaughn aren't a race to inspire lust in humans. They kind of look like someone shoved a rudimentary skeleton into a squid. They have a skull on an invertebrate neck stalk, an abbreviated ribcage analog, and bones for added leverage in 4 of their 8 limbs. They can casually slip a lot of those bones out of joint, sacrificing strength for speed and flexibility. It also makes them look like a deep-sea creature that has inexplicably fallen off a skyscraper. Not great model material. The whole makeup incident had some positive side effects. The Vaughn use a lot of medical magic at the end of their lives. Once everyone had gotten a visceral example of how hard and fast magic evaporates, under the inspection of a room full of skeptical humans, our scheduled meetings with some of the more senior staff were cancelled. It would have been bad for the discussions if the head of the embassy screamed and collapsed into dust. Second, it gave Control and me something to gossip about. He proved to be a pretty good guy, even if he was uptight about human tech, and neither of us was very busy as the port was mostly shut down for the big meeting. We passed the time comparing cultures, swapping stories, and griping about our bosses, or building an intercultural rapport, as I put in my status reports. I said goodbye to my parents last night. Father was brave, but it almost pushed me over the edge when my mother began to cry, Control said out of the blue. Well, he didn't say anything of the kind. He made a series of pops, squeaks, and clicks that the human ear could barely follow, and it would have been quite a huge coincidence if the Vaughn cry. But I had my translator set to dynamic equivalence. As such, that was what I heard, and there was no robotic voice breaking into his words to explain. Explosive flatulence is an expression of sadness for the Vaughn, or whatever. Buddy, you're going to be fine. Your people wouldn't want to trade for our warp drives if they weren't safe. And you've given us, like 10 whole planets if this works? If! And my people aren't thinking clearly. What is the horrible death of a single comms operator if it might alleviate the biggest weakness of our magic? Control could be a downer sort of squid. We were still calling each other Control and Helm, because he couldn't pronounce Jeff, and I couldn't pronounce engine that really needs oiled sounds. I cast about for something to distract him, and found in the form of a rather grand Vaughn in the corner of the room. He had on robes stitched with precious materials, and held a quartz staff shot with veins of natural gold, surmounted by a huge ruby. He was wearing a very grand hat, though it actually looked more like a sombrero than the pointy thing humans associate with fictional wizards. All right, even if your people would throw you to the wolves, that guy is pretty important and magically experienced. He wouldn't get onto this ship if all non-humans were doomed, would he? The High Mage is the foremost master of spatial magics, so yeah, he's pretty important. He also has considerable faith in his own abilities, perhaps enough that he would underestimate the risk. Despite his words, Control's simulated tone sounded a bit less stressed. I felt I was on the right track to comfort him. This stuff is pretty good, right? Some sort of magical armor? Control and I were hanging plates of enchanted material the Vaughn had provided around one of the aft cargo bays, like it was so much drywall. However, even to a complete Mundy like me, it appeared to be fancy stuff. It was pattern-welded like Damascus steel, only the patterns in it were magical runes, and half a dozen materials had been woven together in its construction. Control sniffed in an offended way. Pretty good. Magical armor? I'll have you know that's the best anti-magic armor in the known universe. This, he stroked it almost reverently, enforces the rules of reality such that no spell may travel through it. This material accounts for some of the vast might of the Von military, as well as the fact that our natural philosophy is far more advanced than any other race. It will contain a bubble of the real universe, even in the face of your horrific drive system. Control was sounding a bit more like himself, so I let him slide on referring to their Iron Age understanding of the laws of reality as advanced. Instead, I looked back at the magical plating. It was basically a weak version of the human effect. Interesting. No wonder they were letting me touch it. I thought that was just a sort of stress test, but this might be a spell humans couldn't break. Or could we? Actually, it was probably best not to think about that question in case the answer was yes. The High Wizard chose that moment to provide something better for me to think about. He was still over by his crate, but now he was loudly chanting something my translator couldn't handle, while he twisted his tentacles and limbs into all manner of strange shapes. That went on for a moment. Then, with a triumphal air that carried across species, he slammed his staff into the deck, and the big gem on top flashed. With growing excitement, I realized I was watching magic. The pallet of material in front of the wizard heaved itself off the ground and wobbled unsteadily about half a foot in the air for a moment. I started to mouth, "Cool!" Then the entire load slammed back into the ground with a crash that sounded like it couldn't have been good for whatever was inside. The High Wizard slumped, and let me tell you, a being whose skeleton is mostly optional can really slump. Then he turned around in that slow, "Did anyone see that?" way of a being who has just realized their fly is open and hurriedly fixed it in public. When he saw me, he stiffened and pointed an angry appendage. "Human, you are rendering it impossible to work! Begone!" I drew in breath for some sort of retort, but I'm not sure what it would have been. Something so clever and scathing would have set diplomatic relations back decades. Probably. But then I felt the weight of Control's tentacle on my shoulder. I looked back at him. "Perhaps it would be best if you returned to your duties elsewhere. We are well ahead of our schedule due to your wondrous electric screwdrivers, which penetrates the anti-magic plate where our most potent tools fail. It will ease the High Wizard's work if he can once again access his spells." The High Wizard could have accessed a hand truck as far as I was concerned. But we were nearly done, so I just nodded. "All right. Call me if you have any problems." "Comm check. Medical bay here." I spoke into the comms panel in the med bay. It was my station for our test flight. There were half a dozen Vaughn soldiers lying unconscious in the beds. Half of them had been tranquilized via human medical science, half with magic. Human medical personnel buzzed around them. This is the converted cargo bay. Bay A3, can you hear me? Did I activate this correctly?" "You're on. Do it just like that if you need to send any messages." "Bridge here. Your headset should be listen only on our general channel, and I've got the wall panel hooked to Captain's priority. Is it all coming in?" I cocked my head and listened to the pre-launch chatter for a moment on that device. It was all coming in clearly. At the moment, they were working through the end of the station ready checklist. That meant we were less than 5 minutes from getting underway. "It's all coming in," I told the bridge via the wall panel. "Very good. Bridge over." I leaned back on the wall and felt minor shudders go through it as the first of the fusion pulses went off. We were moving further away from everything so we could go FTL. It was somewhat strange to be doing nothing during this part of the flight, as I would normally be at my busiest. At the moment, my job was to have no job. That way, I could keep track of where we were in our flight sequence, so I'd know how long it was to the end of the flight, and what our window was on an emergency abort, while simultaneously being available to Control and the medical staff if anything went pear-shaped on their ends. For 15 minutes, we traveled through normal space and everything went smoothly. The magical sleepers stayed asleep, and the medicated sleepers stayed healthy. Control reported back to his superiors magically, and me via the comms system. He even admitted that fusion explosions were a softer means of propulsion than he'd expected. I heard we were at a minimum safe distance on the general channel, so opened the channel back to Control and spoke into it and the room in general. "All right, everyone, we're about to go superluminal. 15 minutes out, 15 minutes back." The anesthesiologist gave me the thumbs up, but everyone else in the room kept their eyes glued to their tasks. "Grace of magic, protect and provide in this hour of need," Control murmured over the comms. I doubted I was expected to comment on that. Going FTL in a human ship feels a bit like getting pushed and poked from half a dozen directions at once, as the gravitational stabilizers spin up hard enough to prevent spaghettification, and then self-tune until the local gravity field is nice and even again. I felt that, heard a series of agitated clicks over the comms, and then everything went back to normal. I looked around at the brightly lit medical space, and the still apparently peaceful Vaughn laying on it. They seemed good. I thumbed open the channel to the converted cargo bay. "Control, how are you liking the ride?" "Was it meant to feel like someone was tugging on my spleen for a moment, then smooth out?" "Yeah, that's about right." "In that case, my situation remains nominal." Control's all-clear report cut out suddenly, as two things happened simultaneously. First, there was a loud bang and a thick cloud of white acrid smoke rolled out of the communications panel in front of me. Second, all three of the magically tranquilized soldiers began to jerk and seize. "Shit," the anesthesiologist swore. Then she looked over at me. "Let the bridge know we're going to need to abort." She immediately turned back to her work, either not noticing the panel in front of me was dead, or deciding that was my problem. Doctors are focused like that. The touchscreen of the comms panel was dark, but I gave it a couple of good jabs with my thumb anyway, hoping that it would wake back up. It didn't. So I took off running out of medical and down the hall to the bridge. The frontier is bigger than most people picture when they think spaceship, but it was still going to be faster to run across it than it was to fix the comms. Only, it wasn't. The first bulkhead door I came to was shut, which isn't normal, and its motion sensor ignored my approach, which is even odder. All the bulkhead doors have a little screen next to them. Under ordinary circumstances, they displayed an identifier, and can provide a little map of the ship if you're lost. During a depressurization event, which is the only thing that should have made the door fail shut, they're supposed to display environmental status for the corridor beyond, and allow for the door to be manually opened. Only now, the screen was dark, and there were scorch marks on the panel above it. I gave the screen a punch, more out of anger than any hope that it would wake up. It didn't wake up. It did fall off the wall. I looked into the recess beyond it, and found a small scattering of black powder, as well as the remnants of what looked like a crystal, and maybe a couple of liquids. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but the crystals sure seemed like Vaughn magic, and the black stuff could have been gunpowder. Down the hall, the anesthesiologist poked her head out of medbay. "Hey, we've got the Vaughn under again, but we're getting some odd readings. It's like they've all started to have nightmares. What's going on with the abort?" "Sabotage, I think. We're still superluminal." My receive-only headset was fine and still connected to the bridge, so I knew we were 4 levels deep and holding with all systems green. They hadn't noticed the link to the medical bay was dead yet. "There are panels in all of these rooms. Maybe I can..." My clever plan to make the call from a different phone was interrupted by a huge explosion from the direction of the cargo bay. This one definitely wasn't caused by black powder. Instead of a bang, the sound of it was like a super high-pitched tuning fork being struck, and flashes of black light strobed all around us for a moment. I felt nothing, of course, but someone in the medical bay yelled, "Fuck! What the hell was that? It's hitting the Vaughn hard! Anne, we need you!" Anne shot me a look, then vanished back into medical without speaking. We were close to the cargo bay, and I knew it had a comlink. So, I sprinted in that direction, planning to call in the abort from there once I had the full situation. Fortunately, the door to the cargo bay was open. The screen next to it was glitching, and there was a black stain on the wall above it. But whatever had happened hadn't been enough to make it fail shut. I sprinted through without slowing. The bay itself was a mess. The anti-magic paneling was fine, and the human equipment looked about like it always had. But all the Vaughn's crates were scattered like they'd been hit by a strong wind. Control was laying in one corner, making an undulated, squealing sound that I'd never heard from him before. My translator couldn't do anything with it, but it sounded like distress to me. "Buddy, are you okay? What's going on?" I feel it's like magic is looking directly at me. I feel like it's judging me, inspecting me. I can function, the plating helps, but this is most unpleasant." Was that what the flash was? "No, that was..." Then the English from my translator dissolved into clicks and pops, as it found a term it couldn't handle. Most likely it was some technical explanation of whatever magical thing had just happened. "I must check on the High Wizard." The Frontier's cargo bays are modular, and can be configured with extra walls and dividers as needed. That's what we'd done for this experiment. We'd set up one chamber that was the correct size for the amount of anti-magic plating the Vaughn provided, and a second unshielded chamber where the High Wizard could work freely. Control was looking at the door between them. It had been mostly covered by crates when the Vaughn equipment was thrown around. "The door's servos are pretty strong. If you can squeeze your way over to the control panel, they'll be able to push that stuff out of the way." "I can do that," Control said, and the translator gave him a confident tone. Then he started popping his ribs out of joint, and I had to look away as his entire torso crumpled up like an old sock that had been used to store nails. No, I have no idea why someone would store nails in an old sock, but if the mental image of a being looking like that is unpleasant, you're on the right track. I walked over to the comm panel and, at last, found something that hadn't been inexpertly blown up. It was showing that the link to the medical bay had been cut out unexpectedly, which I already knew. I cleared that error and connected to the bridge instead. As soon as the channel was open, the bridge officer started speaking. "Cargo bay? What's happening back there? Medical is offline." "This is Jeff. Medical has problems. I need an emergency abort." There was some garbled, but energetic, discussion on the other end of the line that I couldn't quite follow, and then the bridge came back. I've signaled it, but we're in band transition. I'll need 5 minutes to get us back to flat space. Across the room there was a whine of stressed servos, but when I looked back, the door to the High Wizard's chamber was open. Okay, I'm going to check on the High Wizard. I should be back with his status in 30 seconds. If you need me sooner, I've still got the general channel and receive only. Roger. What I didn't tell the bridge, because they couldn't do anything about it at the moment, was that I suspected the High Wizard's status was traitorous bastard. Someone had set all of these black powder charges, and when I looked over at control, I found him pressed up against a film of blue light, which now filled the door. It's a magical shield! I drew the sidearm I'd been issued before we let a half-dozen soldiers and an alien wizard onto the ship. Magical shields aren't fucking real! The shield popped like a soap bubble, and Control went stumbling into the High Wizard's chamber. I ran to the door, crouched down, and looked around it with my head low to the ground, so I wouldn't provide a ready target. The scene beyond the door was like something out of a D&D game. There was a circle drawn on the floor in the milky blue-white fluid Vaughn used for blood. Crystals, each one emitting enough black light that my uniform was fluorescing, were set at regular intervals around the outside of the circle. There was a ring of symbols on the inside. I can't read Vaughn's script. They could have said anything, but they were glowing a nasty, sickly green. The High Wizard was on the outside of the circle, on the far side of the room. Right after I arrived at the door, he finished a chant that my translator couldn't handle, and turned to face Control, who was sprawled on the floor. The real piece de resistance of the whole scene was what looked like an extra-large Vaughn made of glowing green light in the center of the circle. We all froze for a second, but the High Wizard recovered fastest. So, you survived the... My translator dropped a word. That's most impressive. You must have considerably more magical talent than I gave you credit for. What are you doing? Control demanded. I am gaining power! The power we need to ensure the Vaughn place in the universe. Power far more potent than human scraps. I can't let you interfere. With that, he raised his staff and snapped out an untranslatable word. A bolt of power lanced out of the staff and flew across the room. In his prone position, Control never had a chance at dodging. The bolt caught him squarely and he slumped back down, as a nasty burnt fish smell filled the air. The wizard wasn't holding any weapon beyond his staff that I could see. I stood, trained my sidearm on his chest, and stepped into the doorway. Please put the staff down and I will escort you to the bridge. I glanced down at the still form of my friend. You have considerable diplomatic immunity for what you've done thus far, but I would strongly advise you not to push it any further. He said his word again, only this time the spell was pointed at me, and there wasn't so much as a flicker in the crystal of the staff. Put down the staff, I said around clenched teeth. Oh, please allow me, a third voice said. It was very cultured and smooth, and it came out from the center of the circle. When I looked, I saw that the figure of light had transformed itself from a Vaughn to a handsome human male. It was wearing a suit, and it was built on a scale such that its head was nearly brushing the ceiling. It flicked its hand out at the High Wizard, and the High Wizard turned inside out. That was nasty. The wizard's jaws yawned wide, and it started to let out a pained squeal. Then, with a crack, they jerked just a bit wider and filled with bluish tissue that must have come from somewhere inside the being. Over the next 15 seconds, more of its insides fountained through its mouth until they were all outside, and it was nothing but an unidentifiable blob of flesh lying on the floor. I opened my mouth. I supposed I wanted to say something, but if anything came out, it was only a whimper. The thing did not appear to be overly concerned with what it had done, because it began speaking in a completely casual and urbane tone. You are something very interesting. He was a sleeper who dreamt a dream not of this place. But you... I can't tell if you're a dream of the one who dreamt of all this, or if maybe you just happened. Still, you are completely awake. I dare say we have quite a bit to offer each other. Would you like to be able to change all of this like that thing could before I killed it? You're offering me magic? Just like that? Just like that. Well, there's a certain resonance I need to achieve by killing the other beings on this ship. I can explain why later, but you need to decide quickly. I can feel you falling away from me, and your nature is pushing me away. I don't think one of your type could ever get me back on your own. I know a couple of TV show tough guy lines like, "Here's my decision," or "Is this quick enough for you?" ran through my head. But I'm pretty sure I just robotically trained my weapon on him and pulled the trigger, without saying anything. My sidearm is a standard gravitational compression gun. It fired a pulse of gravitational energy which compressed a meter-wide column of air between me and the target into a centimeter-wide beam of burning white plasma. Then a second pulse rippled down the plasma and slammed it into the target. There was a crack like thunder as the air collapsed back in on itself, and my eyes were left slightly dazzled. The GC gun does horrible things to any living target it hits. It's not quite as hard on outer horrors, but they don't like it. The simulacrum of a man let out a bellow of rage and wavered for a moment before stabilizing again. "Fine!" it snapped, then raised its hand and made a gesture like it had at the High Wizard. I felt a painfully sharp tug at my jaw and stomach simultaneously, but it faded before it could even work my jaws open. I squeezed the trigger of my GC again, and the thing waved under another onslaught of plasma, but it only seemed like a momentary inconvenience for it. Worse yet, I could hear someone saying something about a slow warp band collapse on the bridge general channel. We were having a hard time coming out of FTL. That's not completely unusual, and no one on the bridge was that worried. With the context I had, it seemed bad. The man shape made a different gesture, then joined its two hands together such that its thumbs and fingers touched in front of it, making a little triangle. A bar of silver light shot out of the triangle and slammed into my chest. It felt like an icicle stabbing into me, and I staggered backward. When I looked down, frost coated the front of my uniform, along with a small patch of blood. Still, the thing had a shocked look on its face, and I had to assume that was because I was still standing. I looked around the room, trying to find a better way to affect it. My eyes caught the staff the High Wizard had been holding. It was laying by the lump of flesh that had been the wizard. It was as though the thing and I were having a hard time affecting each other. I thought we weren't quite sharing the same reality, no matter what it looked like. I also thought that staff might poke further into whatever reality the thing existed in than I did. I bolted around the circle and grabbed the staff off the floor. As I came up with it, another bolt of silver ice energy hit me right in the neck. That hurt like hell. The wound had opened and bled a lot faster, and it left me gagging and choking as I struggled to recover. I needed to end this fast before the thing managed to catch me where it really mattered. I leapt toward it, swinging the staff in a wide, flat arc, right at the thing's stomach, which was near the height of my own shoulders. The gem at the top of the staff connected solidly. There was no wavering light this time. Instead, the thing staggered back, making a truly pained sound for the first time. It bent over, clutching at its stomach. That was a bad idea, as that brought its head into easy striking range. I landed a solid blow on the side of its head. There was a cracking sound, and for just a moment I thought maybe I'd shattered its skull. I hadn't. It probably didn't even have a skull in the first place. I'd snapped the gem in the top 8 centimeters of the staff. When I realized that, I felt a brief shock of fear that my weapon was going to give up before it had done its job. Then, I realized the broken end of the staff was far sharper than it had been. It had cracked around a vein of gold that ran through it, giving it a spear-sharp tip. I took that tip and stabbed it as deep as I could into the thing's guts. There was a flash of light and a huge concussion wave that picked me up and threw me across the room. Where the spear had penetrated the thing, the light that made up its body fell away, leaving a black sphere in its center. The sphere grew, rapidly, and swallowed up both the thing and the staff. Then there was a second flash, and it was just gone. Control, who was not dead after all, sat up and looked at me. "By purest enchantment, what was that?" "You're asking me?" Oddly enough, the test flight went down as a qualified success. The medically tranquilized Vaughn made it through the whole trip with nothing worse than a few bad dreams for their trouble. One of them described it as being like the night before a big test. You don't sleep well, and it's all vague worries of being judged keeping you up. Future trials had found that discomfort could be eliminated by combining sedation with anti-magic plating. Control and I explained what had happened to the High Wizard, and the diplomatic corps basically shrugged it off. One of their senior guys said, "Do not call upon that which you cannot put down," and everyone else nodded sagely. I guess that's a real rule of magic in addition to being a Lovecraft quote. I also suspect the High Wizard had rubbed a lot of Vaughn the wrong way. The human delegation had a similarly muted reaction. However, I'm not sure they completely believed my story, or, rather, They believed it, but it was just too far-fetched to take seriously. Control eventually moved to Earth. We had a huge demand for magic users to handle communications with magical traffic inbound to the Jovian transfer station, where they switched to science-based transports. I'm sure he made bank even when he was just a lowly comms tech, and he rapidly ascended through the ranks until he was running a whole team of aliens from all over the galaxy. However, he once confessed to me that the main draw was being surrounded by magic-suppressing humans. As to humanity in general, well, the universe grumbled a bit and then scooted over to make room for us on the beach. The Umalak and the Vaughn got along better these days because the Vaughn had been humbled, just a bit, and the humans frequently act as intermediaries. Human products are traded throughout the galaxy, and our tech is highly valued basically everywhere. Sadly, human travelers are somewhat more restricted. A few ports are open to us, but we'll probably never see the cloud cities of Antares V with our own eyes. Still, it's nice to know there's magic out there among the stars. However, it had better mind its manners and keep its distance.